Good morning. On behalf of the Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, it's my great honor to welcome you to the 2001 Annual Symposium on Arab World, Diasporas, and Migrations. Now, as a first-generation immigrant to the United States and as someone whose family was scattered to the four corners of the globe as a result of a civil conflict, the theme of this year's symposium has a very personal resonance for me. But also at the level of scholarship, I believe that the lack of systematic and holistic approaches to diasporic and migratory movements is one of the more puzzling blind spots in our field of studies. And this has, I think, very clear consequences for our understanding of such varying topics as the makings of the modern state in the Arab world, the constructions of local or regional identities, relations between urban centers and rural communities, and what Julia Clancy Smith has very recently referred to as the region's literatures of motion. And we will have the opportunity today and tomorrow to listen to specialists and experts with very long and distinguished records of engagement and involvement with diasporic studies. And this is mostly not only in the context of the Arab or the Muslim worlds, but with the global perspective. And also I'm very pleased to note that we will have approaches that that range from the historical to the theoretical to the practical. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers to Georgetown University and to become more familiar with their individual works. Before we proceed, though, I would wish to thank my colleagues on the symposium committee, Professors Fida Adeli, Rochelle Davis, Yvonne Haddad, Joseph Sassoon, Susan Martin, Elżbieta Gozdziak. They made the planning of the symposium as enjoyable a process as it was instructive and hopefully successful. My thanks also to our panel chairs, Professors Rochelle Davis, Simon Shahata, Elliot Kola, Jean-François Seznek, and Elżbieta Gozdziak. And also on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank the wonderful and indefatigable staff of the Center for Contemporary Studies, whose responsibilities in planning and arranging the conference were crucial and invaluable. And especially I would like to mention Maggie Daher, our Public Affairs Coordinator, and Marina Krikorian, our Information Officer. And I will now pass the microphone to my esteemed colleague and our keynote speaker, Professor Louise Cainkar, who really needs no introduction. Her work on Arabs and Muslims in the United States is a landmark reference on immigration and integration. And anyone remotely interested in these topics is sure to have read her riveting and pace-setting ethnographic study of the impact of the September 11th attacks on Arab and Muslim American communities. And these findings were published in 2009 with the title Homeland Insecurity, the Arab American Experience After 9/11. Dr. Cainkar is a sociologist and assistant professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Studies at Marquette University. She teaches courses in the social welfare and justice, sociology, and anthropology majors. Her areas of expertise include Arab American studies, Muslims in the United States, and immigration and integration. And prior to joining Marquette, Professor Cainkar worked mainly in the human rights and social welfare and justice and nonprofit sectors, and also as a consulting researcher. So obviously, we are getting not only scholarly insight, but very deep practical expertise. So she was finally a research fellow at the University of Illinois Chicago at the Great Cities Institute from 1998 to 2005. And this was the period during which she was able to complete the data analysis for her 3-year ethnographic study, which led to the publication of Homeland Insecurity. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Louise Cainkar. Thank you.
Happen there. Thank you to Georgetown for inviting me, and thanks to my colleagues for the honor of sharing this conference with you. Okay, Can you all hear me? I decided when I was asked to give the keynote that probably the most important thing I could do was provide an overall kind of global context of Arab migrations and diasporas. And that required me to really swim in a body of literature and statistics that was immense, and then to kind of hone it down and narrow it down to something I could do in a short period of time. But I must say I really enjoyed the swim. Today the paper, I'm going to set my timer here, excuse me. Okay. My paper has an introduction, then I talk about Arab migration within the Arab world, which is nearly half of Arab migration actually right now, and then I talk about Arab migration in Europe and the countries of immigration, and then I talk about the numbers that we have on the broader Arab diaspora globally, and I have a conclusion. So let me start, and I'm going to start with a quote from Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet. "Don't live in the world as if you were renting or here only for the summer, but act as if it was your mother's house." And this quote struck me because Hikmet's passionate call not to live life as if you were temporary or as if you were a renter is something that is really so often denied to people who migrate to other places. Migration is a perennial human phenomenon, one that was only occasionally tabulated before the 20th century. The century that witnessed an explosion of formerly bounded nation states, official travel documents, visa requirements, transportation options, and state controls on human movement. Today, the number of people living as migrants is over 200 million, or 1 in every 33 persons, but notably 1 of every 13 Lebanese. Their movement patterns are shaped by the availability of visas, the knowledge of suitable work opportunities, geographic proximity, historic relationships, safety concerns, family reunification, and social networks. Today's geographic spread of migrants is wider than ever before since tabulated, and the value of remittances that migrants sent to their homelands has increased exponentially. Nonetheless, only about 3% of the world's population lives as migrants, and 4% of Arabs. As migration became formalized and monitored in the 20th century, migrants were increasingly defined by the papers they did or did not carry, the parameters of their lives framed in relationship to this officially defined status. This process of reification has caused us, I think, to lose touch with the shared humanity of the migrant. Formal distinctions between immigrants, labor migrants, guest workers, contractual workers, refugees, asylees, students, forced migrants, undocumented migrants, have helped us to lose sight of the fact that all of these migrants are people who share the same demands of life, and the minimum of that is dignity. My objective in this talk is to set the stage for this conference on Arab migrations and diasporas by providing a quantitative overview of current demography and to broadly interpret its social condition using the concept of human dignity. One productive way of thinking about Arab migrations and diasporas is to shed the blinders imposed by all these categories of migrants and to think instead about migrants and migration and the recent popular revolutions occurring across the Arab world as two sides of the same coin. In large part, both migration and revolution are actions taken in response to discontent with inequality, authoritarianism, blocked aspirations, obstructed possibilities, corruption, stagnation, and the loss of a sense of agency that accompanies these conditions. Migration is not principally a response to poverty, although it can be. Indeed, research shows that the poorest members of any country are the least likely to migrate. Only at poignant, some have called them epic historic moments, do sweeping waves of popular rebellions occur. Migration, on the other hand, is an unremitting human rebellion. It is a perennial and persistent, indeed unstoppable, human quest for dignity and autonomy. While the place in which the migrant lands may determine his or her category on the schemata of immigrants, the essential quest of all migrants is the same. Even for those for whom migration was not a choice, such as refugees, asylees, and the internally displaced, share the fundamental demand for dignity. And yet it is this very dignity that migrants seek that so often eludes them when they assume their new status as strangers. While the migrant seeks a life of dignity and freedom to construct a personal world that offers safety, some of the comfort of the familiar, and the chance to provide for life's necessities, he or she, whether he or she is wealthy, poor, or middle class, this holds true for all, no matter what category. And although surely financial resources help ease some of the pain of the disruptions of the migratory experience, dignity cannot be purchased. Dignity is a crucially important concept, yet I think it's something that we scholars really don't measure very well. And I think it's better portrayed in poetry and literature and film than in social science. I have a quote here from Anthony Shadid, whose fate is still unknown, I think, right? Anyhow, he wrote it from Cairo on February 2nd, 2011. And he said, dignity, karama, was a word often used Wednesday, and its emphasis underlined the breadth of a movement that is so far leaderless. Neither the Brotherhood nor a handful of opposition leaders have managed to articulate hopelessness, the humiliations at the hands of police, and the outrage at having too little money to marry, echoed in the streets of Palestine, Jordan, and Baghdad. So, as recognized by the crafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by philosopher Martha Nussbaum, economist Amartya Sen, dignity flows from being able to act on one's human capabilities and express oneself politically, civilly, socially, and culturally without arbitrary encumbrances or economic barriers. Dignity includes being able to live in a place where no one feels free to spit on you or call your children terrorists. Dignity precludes distributing civil and political rights according to a dress code. Dignity is observed among Egyptian migrants in Jordan who suddenly hold their heads up high because of esteem earned from events transpiring in their homeland. A dignified state is thus the opposite of otherness. Human dignity should transcend borders, but when borders are sites of exclusion, dignity is among the first sites of battle. Okay, I am going to, I talk here about some of the things we study as scholars of migrants. We study state policies and how they create different senses of otherness among migrants. And we study the ways that migrants decline and resist and surmount these states of otherness. We study the material cultures migrants produce in their new homes, and we realize that they remain alive and productive in their new homes, creating fusions, fashioning new modes of dress, creating literature, poetry, art. These are the products of the stranger. But these products are often derided by representatives of host countries who hold them up as proof of the migrant's essential human difference, or of the unwillingness of the migrant to imitate the host who has already rejected them. But as Fanon and Dubois, among others, have written, the price of self-effacing emulation is self-hatred, and ultimately the loss of dignity. We study the hybridized worlds of migrants' children and grandchildren whose challenges are different from their forebears as they seek to accommodate and resist and fuse the two cultures they know, that of their parents, or that imagined and remembered by their parents, and that of the place in which they were born. Their language skills render them potential outsiders in their parents' homeland, but their socially constructed differences render them potential outsiders in their own place of birth. These children of immigrants pursue lifelong quests for knowledge, identity, return, and a sense of belonging, in a world that often compels them to choose one place or another, that often measures their loyalty by an answer to the question, where is home? Indeed, the notion of home, the notion of home nips at the heart and soul of migrants and their descendants. And it seems to rip and yank most profoundly, perhaps ironically, in places where migrants have been granted permanent residence, because permanence is often accompanied by costly demands on personal dignity. In some places, however, home is never permitted to be in question. Places where full social membership is not even a remote possibility for the migrant. In these places, migrants are informed a priori that they have little chance to be more than that for which their visa has been granted. They are the sweat of their brows. Here, the human being on the same quest for dignity, autonomy, and creativity is referred to as the labor migrant, the guest worker, the illegal, suggesting that he or she is somehow a different type of person. who needs little more than a paycheck, and whose human expression can be justifiably circumscribed, when the way in which this person is actually different is the state in which he or she landed himself or herself. So now I'm going to move on to the Arab world. The Arab world is the global leader in the category of labor migrant states. 7 of the top 10 states with the highest proportion of foreign-born residents are located in the Arab world. Qatar ranks first with 87% of its population foreign-born, followed by the UAE with 70%, Kuwait with 69%. Fourth and fifth are Jordan and the occupied Palestinian territories, with 46 and 44% foreign-born. And then following Singapore, Israel, and Hong Kong are Oman and Saudi Arabia. This statistically significant and otherwise unlikely regional concentration of nations with high ratios of foreign-born residents is a result of 3 interrelated phenomena: the existence of globally valued natural resources sealed within fixed boundaries of ownership, exclusivist states and nationalisms, and demographic dispossession and war. The foreign-born in these places are overwhelmingly defined by the categories labor migrants and refugees. And of course, concealed within this category, foreign-born, is the Palestinian diaspora in motion, uprooted multiple times, always tagged as strangers. Okay. There are an estimated 15 million migrants in the 6 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the majority of whom are men. Indeed, GCC countries also stand out for having the lowest rate of female migration. And I'm going to skip the numbers here, but they're in the paper. These asymmetrical gender data indicate the absence of family, the presence of gendered worlds of migrants. In fact, the women who migrate to the Gulf are recruited for their capacity to love. Their love is gold, as sociologist Arlie Hochschild would say. And so they leave their children behind in their homelands to take care of other people's children. But the majority of migrants in the GCC countries are not Arabs. In the 1970s, Arabs were about 30% of the foreign-born in these countries. Today, they are less than 10%. And this demographic change is not because there's a shortage of Arabs seeking work, but it's rather largely due to calculated de-Arabization policies of these states, a major impact of which was to shrink the world of possibilities for Arabs on the quest for dignity and autonomy. The paradoxical result of this state of affairs is while the Middle East is one of the fastest growing migrant receiving regions in the world, the Arab world also has the highest regional unemployment rate in the world. Migration, rebellion. You see the connection there. Overall, of an estimated 13 million Arab migrants in the world today, 45% live in Arab countries, including nearly 70% of Arab immigrants from the Mashriq. The rest are scattered about the world, although substantially in OECD countries. Migrants from the Arab Maghreb are more likely to live in Europe than in the Arab world, although even 1 million of them live in the GCC countries. One might conclude from this data that the largest concentration of Arab diasporas is in the Arab world. Yet few of us who study Arab migrations and diasporas make this point, except perhaps when speaking of Palestinian, Armenian, and Iraqi diasporas. And there are a few reasons why this is the case. First of all, the study of diasporas usually describes multiple generations, although this is not a requirement. In the social sciences, diasporas are distinguished not by reproduction, but by persistent identities, social and emotional ties to the homeland, and a desire to return. All of these characterize Arab migrants in the Arab world. But what lies behind the persistent attachment of these migrants to their homelands? Is it the policies of the governments themselves that prevent them from building families? Is their yearning to return about other things? What are their experiences in these parts of the world? We really don't know for sure because we don't ask these questions. We have reified this concept of labor migrant to the extent that the questions we ask are about labor. You know, we talk about kafala system and remittances and housing and human rights, but we don't really penetrate deeply into the full breadth of cultural and civic and emotional and psychological lives of Arab migrants in the Arab world. Another reason I think we don't talk about the Arabs, migrants in the Arab world as a diaspora is because it requires excavating the space that lies between the shared and the exclusive. For example, the logic that material resources are owned exclusively by certain nation states, but food, language, poetry, music, and literature is pan-Arab. Within the contradiction between the shared cultural and the exclusive political and economic is the explanation for why there are labor shortages and massive unemployment at the same time in the Arab world. How do these contradictions and exclusions play out in the everyday lives of Arab migrants in the Arab world? What types of states of otherness do they produce? What actions do these migrants take to resist their dehumanization? These are some of the questions we must ask to fully humanize Arab migrants in the Arab world, who we know best in a unidimensional way as Homo economicus. Okay, I'm going to skip all this about remittances. Between the work and the remittance is the complex world of the migrant, whose heart and soul is split in two places, torn from family and the familiar, living in a gendered world, and valued almost exclusively for one dimension of themselves, their work. Yet in this liminal status, this migrant remains an active creator and producer of culture and social interaction. And I suggest we need to look at that more. And I find it very interesting. Why should Arab migrants living in the Arab world want to return home more than Arab migrants in the United States or Europe, where they face massive discrimination? I mean, it's just like a curious question. Why should they want to return home more? It is incumbent upon us to be comparative and to understand these differences. Okay, because if we don't, we're submitting to the notion that there is no grander human vision possible. I'm going to just quickly say about forced migrants. The Arab world also has the largest number of forced migrants in the world. While 7% of the world's population are refugees, 24% of the Mashriq population is refugee. 77% of the migrants living in the Arab Mashriq are refugees, and the Sudan has the largest number of internally displaced people in the world, and the third largest is Iraq. Okay, I'm going to move on to migrations and diasporas outside the Arab world. And my timer has gone to sleep. Okay. So the remaining 55% of current Arab migrants who live outside the Arab world, a majority of them live in Europe and secondarily North America. And 60% of them lived in the developed market economies of the OECD countries. Nearly half of them live in France, of the 60% outside. The second largest number is in the United States, but at a rate 4 times less than France. Together with France and the United States, 90% of all current Arab migrants living in OECD countries live in the following countries. So there's France, United States, and in order, Spain, Italy, Canada, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Australia, Sweden, and Belgium. 70% of these migrants are Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians, and the other 20% are Iraqis, Egyptians, and Lebanese. The majority of them are men, but Arab women migrate to OECD countries at substantially higher rates than they migrate to Arab countries. Men and women from the Arab Maghreb moved north across the Mediterranean in large numbers after World War II, where they were recruited as guest workers. Their days as colonial subjects still fresh, they were socially positioned in their new homes as workers who otherwise merited a lesser set of rights than citizens, similar to the so-called migrant laborers living in the Arab world, but with some very significant differences. After the 1973 oil embargo, the demand for workers and the rising fuel prices, demand for workers in Europe was substantially reduced, and most European countries prioritized family reunification over importing new labor. As families are intensive sites of cultural reproduction, once migrants have children in their new places of residence, additional factors weigh heavily on their lives, including how to raise these children, which cultural values, religious practices, and memories to transmit to them. We know from research that children will become attached to the only place they know well, will learn the local language, adopt the local culture, even if it is vastly different from their parents, and even if their parents disapprove, and even if they're denied citizenship. Their hybridities emerge from and produce complex understandings of belonging, which are further complicated by the increasingly restrictive naturalization policies of many European states, where many among the fully entitled populations have not embraced the notion that these others are entitled as humans to be more than economic beings, or mirror images of themselves. Master narratives justify their social, cultural, civic, and political exclusion with a colonial flavor, and they revolve around racialized understandings of inferiorities rooted in being Arab and Muslim, charge that these populations are unwilling to socially integrate and adopt their culture. As a result, the Arab populations of Europe, and I'm speaking very generally here, especially North Africans, must often live as perpetual strangers, as renters. These tensions in Europe are exacerbated by the fact that Arabs are a high proportion of the foreign-born in many European countries. For example, 40% of the foreign-born in France are Arabs, 16% in Spain, 14% in the Netherlands, and so on. And as we know well from decades of social research, large numbers, low incomes, and racialized social constructions combine to form explosive combinations. Such communities tend to become concentrated in urban ghettos, locked out of upward mobility, and socially crystallized as the ultimate other. Such communities in turn challenge these degradations and assert their dignity by creating cultures of resistance and a dialectic of mutual rejection, ebbs and flows. When compared to the Arab world and to Europe, current Arab migration to the so-called traditional countries of immigration, and those are the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is relatively small. For example, a statistic from 2000 placed the number of Arab migrants in all of these countries combined at 983,000, or less than half the number of Arab migrants in France alone. These countries, countries of immigration, distinguish themselves by settler colonialism, aggressive replacement of indigenous populations via policies that promote family migration and offer permanent residency, naturalization, and birthright citizenship, and by the racialized distribution of rights. As countries that formally define and promote themselves as ingatherings of multiple nations, ethnic groups, races, and cultures, their understandings of what constitutes national identity, as well as their policies and social receptivity towards migrants, are strikingly different than Europe. Additionally, the social profile of Arab migrants to these countries is quite different from that of Europe in terms of countries of origin, human capital, and many aspects of their lives. Arab migrants to these countries are more likely to be Lebanese, Syrian, Egyptian, Palestinian, and Iraqi than from the Maghreb. Very broadly speaking, Arab migrants in these countries are more likely to be skilled, highly educated, and actively employed than Arab migrants living in Europe. This is just one figure. It's, the labor force participation rate of Moroccans in Belgium was 35%, and in the United States, 71%. This is a massive difference in work, ability to work. As a result of these differences, Arab migrants in Europe are far more likely to be low income than those in the countries of immigration. Also, Arabs in all of these countries, US, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, are less than 5% of the population. So they're a relatively small number in each of these countries. And finally, Arab migrants in these countries are more likely to have political rights because they can naturalize and become citizens. These substantial differences aside, all of these countries are currently places of heightened anti-Arab racism and anti-Muslim social agitation. So the Arab migrant in these countries searching for dignity, freedom, and opportunity also finds barriers and exclusions. And there's kind of this global networking now of Islamophobes. And so you see these recent King hearings in the House of Representatives about the, homegrown Muslim threat. There really is a notion that comes right out of Europe. Thus, although largely economically successful, Arab migrants in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand share points of similarity with Arabs in Europe and with members of other migrant groups who sustain assaults on their human dignity in order to better their lives and feed their families. Yet despite these negative contexts, return migration from all of these countries is very low, replaced instead by circular migration, going back and forth, and short-term visits to the homeland, where migrants continue to leave their imprint on the nations they left behind. Shortages of jobs, low wages, inequality, lack of freedom, and so on continue to push migration and curtail return. So far I've spoken about very broadly about 78% of current Arab migrants. We have many interesting papers here that we'll talk about, others I haven't spoken of. So I want to kind of wrap up with a kind of broad overview of Arab diasporas. I was just talking about migrants, people who are currently migrating. The general preference of children of voluntary migrants to stay in the countries in which they were born creates new tensions for migrants considering return to their homelands, because doing so will break the family apart once again, repeating the pain of departure years back. And so, mostly they stay, or they come and they go. It is in these spaces where multiple generations live outside the original homeland that we most commonly refer to the Arab diaspora. The Arab diaspora outside of the Arab world is estimated to be 30 to 37 million people today, or about 10% of the size of the current population of the Arab world. Although I think that number actually is too small when you consider fertility and generations and these other variables. Anyhow, it's a number we don't really have any good grasp on. The Arab diaspora is organically connected, but yet much farther flung than the dominant patterns of Arab migration I just discussed. Arab diasporas outside of the Arab world have followed notable historic migrations of Yemenis to Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, Omanis to Zanzibar, Somalis and Yemenis to the UK, Lebanese, Syrians, and Palestinians to Central, South, North America, and the Caribbean, Lebanese to Central and West Africa, and really Lebanese to just about everywhere. The majority of these millions are not themselves migrants, but second, third, and fourth generation descendants of migrants. A significant proportion of them have one Arab parent and one second or third generation Arab parent, or one Arab parent and one non-Arab parent, or two hyphenated Arab parents, some of whom have never seen their ancestral homeland. Their identities, ties, institutions, movements, material cultures, and even their sports teams that express an abiding Arabness are the subjects of our research, like the Chilean soccer team is half Palestinian. There was a movie made about that. So before I close, I'm going to present some of the numbers that are available on the size of these Arab diasporas. But I warn you that these data lack precision. Estimates for countries vary widely. And this is not all diasporas. However, I think it is really a worthwhile project for the future to try to get a handle on these numbers. Okay, so let me just run through some of the major Arab diasporas and the numbers you can find. The United States, 3 million. Major groups, Lebanese, Syrians, Egyptians, Palestinians, Iraqis. Canada, 500,000, Lebanese, Moroccans, Algerians, Egyptians, Syrians, and Palestinians. Mexico, 500,000 to 1 million, mainly Lebanese. Europe and the UK, 9 to 14 million. These are the numbers, the range of numbers I found. I've already discussed that's Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, Lebanese, Iraqis, Palestinians. Sub-Saharan Africa, we have the Ivory Coast, 90 to 100,000 Lebanese. Senegal, 20 to 30,000 Lebanese. Sierra Leone, 6 to 10,000 Lebanese. Australia, 400,000 to 1 million. That's a big range. Lebanese, Egyptian, Iraqi, Syrian, mainly. I'm giving the groups that are the largest. Indonesia, 4 million. Singapore, 10,000, mainly Yemenis and Omanis. Brazil, this is the best, 1.5 to 12 million. That's what I found. Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian. In fact, one source I read said there's more Lebanese in Brazil than in Lebanon. Argentina, 1 million to 3.5 million, Lebanese and Syrians. Chile, 500 to 800,000 Palestinians. They claim fourth largest Palestinian population in the world, which is in Chile. Honduras, 150,000 to 200,000, mostly Palestinian, and they claim they have the highest proportion of Arabs in the Western Hemisphere. El Salvador, 150,000 Palestinians. And there are other Arab populations in Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Haiti, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Panama. You know, it's out there. And really, I can only say a few things generically about all of those, except that the numbers are bad. The largest segments of these diasporas were established since the late 19th century. Many of them show substantial Arab presence in trade and commerce, no surprise to anybody who is in this field. And based on the written record, Arab communities in Central and South America and the Caribbean appear to be the most socially integrated, to have the highest rates of intermarriage with the local population, to face the least discrimination, and there's my alarm, and to achieve the highest levels of political office. So if you read about Arabs in South America, you'll find presidents and prime ministers and something. Can you imagine that in the United States? I've often really wondered about the role of racial hierarchies in these outcomes. Anyhow, although largely successful, even 100 years ago, Arab migrants returned to their countries of origin because they beckon them. You can read the poetry and the literature of those early Arab migrants, although the distances were great. So I'm going to conclude just with some sentences here. One point is that no matter how secure a migrant or diaspora community feels in its adopted home, there is always a risk of collective attack or mass expulsion, because that original otherness that may have become obscured can be resurrected easily through social constructions that have political goals. And just in the last 2 decades, we've seen mass flights of Palestinians, Jordanians, and Yemenis from the Gulf states, Lebanese from Sierra Leone, Palestinians from Libya and Iraq, new Iraqi and Sudanese diasporas, 15,000 Arabs and Muslims in the United States issued deportation orders after 2001, and now tens of thousands of Arabs, including Libyans, fleeing Libya. Migration is not an option for everybody. It's a pressure-relieving valve on countries, but it does not resolve the fundamental problems of these countries from which migrants go. One report I read warned that if Arab governments didn't find a way to integrate their massive youth, who are largely educated now, into their economies, violence and civil war would result. But we can see now that there is a third way in the unstoppable human quest for dignity, and that is the recent revolutions shaking the Arab world. Interestingly, these started in the Arab countries where unemployment is highest and made their way to the labor-importing countries of the GCC and Libya, revealing the organic relationship among young generations in the Arab world. Finally, much talk about globalization of technology emerged from these revolutions, and I'd like to say that although it hasn't really changed migration overall, it changes some parts of it. For example, it builds bridges between immigrant and homeland. It allows people to visit more. It allows people to migrate in circular patterns. It allows people to stay in touch through low-cost communication. And in that way, these new technologies are able to heal some of the wounds that accompany migration. Thank you.